Alright, welcome to Chapter 3 here. Now we're getting into a little bit more of the specifics. Some of this is a little more foundational, just background, but this is a little bit more modern as far as the leadership theories and approaches that we see more common nowadays than some of the previous chapters, just to show the evolution of how leadership has continued to change and evolve even from the theoretical side here. So in Chapter 3, we can think of this as being boiled down a little bit more. And instead of going through all the history and everything of leadership in general, now we're starting to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty and the specifics that a lot of you all may have already encountered or undoubtedly will encounter throughout your sport career, including those that you work for. You might be able to identify some of your current leaders or former leaders or managers that you've worked for through some of these, transformational, transactional, and servant leadership. We'll also talk about authentic. Or you, in the future, you might start to see, oh, okay, yeah, when a leader does these certain things or behaves a certain way, they're kind of fitting into one of these styles and one of these theoretical approaches here. One caveat to throw out here at the beginning is that each one has benefits. It just depends on a little bit of the situation. So going back to the situational leadership, as well as the strengths too. Can somebody really be a great transactional leader and still get things done? Absolutely. Is that going to work all the time? Not necessarily. Same thing with transformational, same thing with servant. So there's pluses and minuses. There's two sides to each coin here as we work through them. Excuse me. So these relationship-oriented leaders tend to focus primarily on organizing, supporting, developing their employees versus task-oriented, which gets a little bit into our previous chapter of being or a manager. Engage in defining work roles and different pursuits of organizational objectives. So basically, are you making your quotas? Are you hitting the numbers that you need to hit or accomplishing those goals and those objectives there that we can measure? This chapter will deviate from some of that and get into more of the leadership aspects here. And this, to me, is really the perhaps one of the more important or integral chapters and topics here for forming what leadership is throughout the rest of the semester as well. So we'll be bringing in transformational, transactional, servant, authentic leadership again and again. This will be the premise for our project as well, so make sure this is something that we get nailed down pretty well. This is going to be pretty important. Transformational leadership, so we'll start here. This is where leaders try to motivate their followers or those around them to change or transform themselves. Ideally, along with that transformation is being able to transform the follower to be a better version of themselves that still helps the team, still helps the organization. So we're helping the follower achieve and reach their potential, but we're also still hoping that that potential helps the organization as well, that we're not just transforming them into some other follower, taking them away or not having them be useful anymore or go outside the scope of what we need as an organization. It's not to say that we hold them back, it's just we try to align it with the organization, the goals of the organization, our group individuals here. So that's that second bullet point here. Transformational leaders, since they do want to see growth in their followers, tend to set challenging but realistic expectations for them. One of the downsides, though, is that sometimes those expectations can be too challenging. And that's where we need to see and really hope that there's good communication between transformational leader and follower. So transformational leadership in a nutshell here, as the name suggests, we're aiming to transform those around us, but we do that with a focus on the leader. And that's where these four dimensions come in. So idealize the influence, includes behaviors, attributes of the leader. The leader needs inspirational motivation, needs to be able to inspire that motivation, so again, getting them to buy in. Intellectual stimulation that comes from having challenging expectations versus easy ones. And individualized consideration. So not taking the blanket approach to everybody, but being able to cater those challenges, cater those expectations to a specific individual follower. So we get into a little bit more detail here for each of the dimensions. So make sure as we're reading through the slides, we understand. So for example here, idealized influence, we see charismatic behaviors of the leader and elements of leadership that are attributed to the leader by his or her followers or their followers. And it's also described as an emotional component of leadership. So again, making sure that we've got that idealized influence because we're dealing with people. So we want to make sure that we've got charismatic behavior to get that buy-in, but we also want to make sure that we realize that we are leading people. We're not leading robots or machines, at least not yet. Unless you're one of the proponents of Terminator becoming our reality, which hopefully it's not the case. Otherwise, we'll be in dire straits if that happens. But transformational leadership, again, just gets at the fact that we are leading people. We need to keep that in mind here. Next, we see inspirational motivation. It captures how leaders will set those clear high expectations, but also motivating them, keeping them engaged, making sure that you don't just set the expectation and let them loose and not support them. And we see individual consideration, intellectual stimulation here as well. So again, these just kind of the more formal aspects here to kind of help supplement the key points mentioned. Excuse me. Now in transactional leadership, this is where we see a little bit more of the management side of things. At least that's how I usually describe it. That's how I usually tend to make sense of it for those around us that I'm working with. And this is something that's still valuable. But as the name suggests, similar to transformational, you could ascertain that there's going to be a transforming part. Transactional leadership means there's some kind of transaction. That transaction is basically, it boils down to a very basic level here. If a follower or subordinate produces, the transaction is they continue to get paid. If they don't produce, they don't continue to get paid. So the leader is expected basically to give something in exchange for receiving the work. So that something's usually pay, it's benefits, time off, maybe a promotion, but it's one where again it's a very basic approach to leadership, and this one is pretty close to the authoritarian aspect that we mentioned in earlier chapters here, and kind of branched from there. Now again, it's still valuable. If you've got followers, you've got a team or organization that's stuck in the mud, so to speak, just is not motivated, needs a shakeup, needs a little bit more of a firmer hand, this type of leader can be quite useful. It's something that can kind of shake things up a little bit. It can get folks motivated that have been complacent, and so there's a good use for it here. It just depends on the situation. This one also has several dimensions, 4 specifically, and those are contingent reward, active management by exception, passive management by exception, and then laissez-faire, which is basically the absence of leadership altogether, and that's a dangerous one to encounter as well. I've been there before, and it's not good. Somebody who's supposed to lead a group isn't, and you're looking around to see who's going to step up. It's a tough situation to be in. So here, just quickly with the dimensions, contingent reward. This is basically where leaders assign a task to followers to fulfill, and that there will be a reward if that's done. So again, pretty straightforward here. I don't think we're breaking anything down that's innovative, but I just want to make sure we're covering things here. Active management by exception, and this is when leader looks for mistakes or deviations from normal standards when monitoring a follower's work. Leaders then take actions to correct any mistakes that they notice. So keep in mind this and that active word compared to the passive aspect here. So leaders following the passive management by exception wait for mistakes or deviations from normal standards. They don't intervene to address the problem until after the fact. So active means we're trying to nip something in the bud beforehand, deter a mistake or teach something to a follower so a mistake doesn't happen. Passive, we let the mistake happen, then we intervene, then we step in. So again, letting the mistake pass, essentially, is a good way to remember it. Laissez-faire, again, that's the absence of leadership. They don't make any decisions, they don't act. I've gone up against, one of the best examples I have is when I coached baseball. I went up against laissez-faire coaches quite a bit, unfortunately, especially at the youth level. I say unfortunately because I feel bad for the kids on the other team because they're not getting coached. They're just kind of out there. Granted, they're probably still having fun, but the teams that I've encountered were not very good. So the fun is kind of minimized, especially as it goes to older age groups where we start to get a little bit more competitive. We want to win. We still want to have fun playing the game, but without that leadership aspect, without a coach who's involved and active, it gets pretty tough. And anytime I went up against those types of coaches, and I started to recognize those coaches after playing them a couple of times, kind of knew that we were going to win. Just because we were well coached, we practiced in a systematic way, involved the players in certain decisions. And again, they were coached. They knew how to perform different things, pick off moves and how to turn a double play, all that kind of stuff there. Whereas some of the other teams weren't. They weren't getting coached that. They didn't have that leadership style. So again, those laissez-faire types of coaches or leaders in general are just not good. And calling them a coach or calling them a leader is still quite generous given that absence there. Next, we get into servant leadership. And servant leadership is really interesting because it branches off from the other two a little bit here. And this boils down to the interaction between leader and follower and how leaders need to be more attentive to the needs of followers as well as tomorrow. So I've been talking throughout the first couple chapters here, leadership's vision-based, it's the big picture. And yet it kind of still gets lost in the shuffle a little bit with some of the other leadership styles. Here, servant leadership deals primarily with serving first, leading second, all in the interest of creating a better tomorrow. So what's the organization or team or person that I'm leading? What do they need? How can I help them? How can I serve them? And how is this going to lead to a better tomorrow? So that could be, how's work going to be easier tomorrow for them? How's our organization going to be better tomorrow? How are they as a person going to be better tomorrow? And what can I do to bridge that gap today? So again, it differentiates itself because it's that ideal of service in that relationship. So it's not a follower serving the leader or follower serving the organization. It's the leader putting the followers and everybody else in position to best succeed and serving them through a people-centered approach. So connecting people, helping network people, getting resources where they need to be most efficient. All while also emphasizing character, good character, ethical behavior, knowing themselves, some humility, stewardship, all these kinds of dimensions and things that are associated with servant leadership here. We've got a few, and I'll, as we continue to hone in on servant leadership, we can kind of go through a little bit more later in the semester here. And it's one that's continued to kind of be evolving right before us. So it's been around 1977. Greenleaf is the scholar who first dubbed it. It laid dormant for quite some time, and then really in the last 10 years we've seen a big emphasis and reemergence of servant leadership, not just in the parent discipline of management and business, but also in sport too. And we see it continue to evolve and adapt. That's why that attempt to build theory here, we see a lot of back and forth as far as the characteristics and dimensions here. So there's later on I'll have a set list of dimensions for servant leadership, but right now I just want to point that out because if you do search for it or you talk to somebody else about it, they might have one view versus somebody else who abides by something else. So our 6 characteristics here that we'll use: developing people, humility, authenticity, interpersonal acceptance, providing direction, and stewardship. So these will be the ones that we'll hone in on here. But again, just want to throw it out there. It's an evolution here that's ongoing with servant leadership, and it's evolving before our eyes. whereas transformational and transactional leadership were pretty solid and have been solid for decades now. We know those dimensions. It's kind of done evolving. They're both done evolving, whereas servant leadership, we're still refining things a bit here. Lastly, we got authentic leadership. This is the final area of leadership that's prevalent to our research and to our course here. This is one that has emerged. I actually did my dissertation work on authentic leadership. I like this one. It focuses a little bit more on the leader themselves before focusing on the interaction or the relationship between leader and follower. So one thing to keep in mind here, and one thing that differentiates authentic leadership from the others, is this is really focused on the leader as a person, who they are. If you've done a SWOT analysis before, or if you've heard the term SWOT analysis, I think that's the perfect model or perfect example of what authentic leadership is. An authentic leader is somebody who, the S from SWOT, knows their strengths. The W knows their weaknesses. The O, they know their opportunities, and then they also know their threats. If you haven't done a SWOT analysis, we'll get into that probably in one of the future courses in the program, but just be aware SWOT analysis stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. An authentic leader knows all of those about themselves. They know themselves, the good, the bad, and everything in between. They also know, and I think an advantage of authentic leadership is that because they know their weaknesses, they know that when they're putting a team together or maybe hiring a coach or assistant coach, they know to seek, hopefully, to seek out somebody whose strengths are their own weaknesses. So an easy example in sport that we can think of is a head football coach. Head football coach who comes from an offensive mind. So they're going to handle a lot of the offensive game planning. They'll still have a assistant offensive coach or offensive coordinator to help with things, but that head coach is probably going to have a heavy influence on the playbook on the offensive side of the ball. Conversely, that means potentially a weakness of theirs or a threat of theirs is the defensive side. So a good authentic leader in that instance, who's a coach, will say, you know what, I need an experienced defensive coordinator, somebody who maybe has even been a former head coach, but has been around. They know the defensive side of the ball, their scheme is up to date, they know how to coach it, they know how to implement it. I need somebody with that skill set there, versus that authentic leader who on the flip side, on the offensive side, they could hire maybe somebody who doesn't have as much experience as an offensive coordinator and be okay because they can kind of groom them and develop them more, but they don't have to worry about them handling everything because they're going to handle a majority of the offensive side. So that's just one example of how an authentic leader can play out and what we tend to see in sport as well. All right, so that's it for Chapter 3 here. So again, this one here, a lot of terminology, so make sure we take some time with this one. It's going to keep coming up, so the good news is that these terms we're going to be focusing on quite a bit. I'm going to make references to these throughout the semester. Some of the readings that we have, there'll be studies involving these different types of leadership styles, or again, we'll be kind of profiling somebody and we'll want to hone in on one of these different styles here.